Hey there, welcome to episode 84 of the Let's Innovate for Vegas audio program. I am your host, Managing Director of the Innovate for Vegas Foundation, Dan Hugo. Today we're recording early for a change. It's just about to be 8 a.m. on this Tuesday, September 24th, 2024. A lot of 24s. Today we're going to speak about the bazaar. That's like a shopping, like a farmer's market. Not to be confused with the similarly sounding, I was almost going to say a word that would have sounded very, very bizarre. Not to be confused with bazaar. This is bazaar, the bazaar. It is a reference to a thing that I will mention in the link section. For the moment, bear with me as I remind you that the Innovate for Vegas Foundation is a Nevada nonprofit, 501c3 public charity. We are dedicated to our purpose, which is to enable and encourage ideation, innovation, and implementation to make our communities better. It doesn't have to be in Las Vegas. You do not need to be in Vegas to innovate for Vegas. Don't forget, Vegas has 40 million, the greater Vegas area has 40 million or thereabouts visitors each year. That's a lot of people to show and tell about open source projects. If you're developing for a community elevation and you can engage 40 million people or some fraction, like maybe half, with community elevation projects that may be interesting to them when they get home, why not? So what is the bazaar? Why that tricky title? Well, hopefully wherever you found this audio program, you're able to read or consume in some way the episode description. There is a summary and a few links, which we will step through now. The summary of today's episode: somewhere around 25 years ago, one of the various open source luminaries, S Raymond, was working on and eventually published a book entitled The Cathedral and The Bazaar, a collection of essays about adventures developing software and business. A lot of open sourceness. We are pursuing the bazaar here, so why not describe what that is a bit in context? The links, as usual, usually the first two, sometimes the first three. Today, the first three. Our homepage, which is finally on the to-do list. It's been bumped off for way too long. It's in desperate need of some polishing. We have a strategy for different component websites, little mini subsites, micro websites, you could say, about our various initiatives and projects. And so the top level will be built with that in mind, with some updates. We need to deploy a few things that will run on our website, so it's not simply a static website. But with all that said, Innovate for Vegas, that's Innovate FOR Vegas, no dashes, underscores, dots, Innovate for Vegas, and then a dot, and then org, innovateforvegas.org. We have a GitHub organization, which we get for free. Thank you, GitHub, Microsoft. Thanks to our being a 501c3 charity organization working on open source projects. That is at github.com/innovateforvegas. Once again, no dots, hyphens, underscores, Innovate FOR Vegas. We have our Project Act organization on GitHub, also free. Thank you once again, Microsoft and GitHub. The Innovate for Vegas Foundation is technically the fiscal sponsor of Project Act for the moment. We'll get some more cohorts and individuals to participate. ACT, by the way, ACT, the Autonomous Cohort Transformation Project, from the early days when there was some consideration for cohorts and now former brigades who were considering going independent, transforming into self-driving, bottom-up, bazaar-style cohorts. Then, when the brigade program was sunset by Code for America, we made this the Autonomous Cohort Tessellation. Tessellation is a mosaic, a collection of tiles. Imagine a tile for every cohort or individual, a tile for projects, and seeing them as a visualization. Some of the things needed to get that information and compile it into such a thing is what we're really working on, which is how to connect, communicate, and collaborate amongst autonomous cohorts, individuals, and groups. A cohort of one is how things begin. and so included explicitly. Now the episode-related links, the looks like Cat B, the Cathedral and the Bazaar. It's a Eric S. Raymond site. It has all of his notes and so on. The writings in the Cathedral-Bazaar subdirectory are based on his presentations he was making prior. This is all around the year 2000 or so. There was a book eventually published by O'Reilly. If you're familiar with the O'Reilly animal books, they usually had an animal on the cover with a corresponding colophalon with all the details. So this is Eric's website with the sort of content under development at the time. Sort of in keeping with his open sourceness, it was all laid out for people to read, and also there are some audio presentations because he used to cover some of this material in talks and presentations he would make. So it's sort of the behind the scenes, the ingredients before the book was published. Cookbook, one of those. Hey, two great tastes. The interesting thing, as he points out in one spot, is that there were some announcements around Cathedral and the Bazaar that coincided with Netscape announcing that they were going to open source all of the communicator, which would eventually become the Mozilla project. I was working at Netscape prior to this. I had moved on to work at a startup since I was not there when they started up, but I had worked at Netscape. I knew all the characters involved. It was very exciting times, and the Mozilla project today persists, even though they're shutting down their Mastodon instance with its 270 regular users, which is fine. Focus on that browser. Cathedral and the Bazaar. The GNU manifesto, by the way, if someone says GNU, it's new. No, if you read through the manifesto, it says towards the bottom that you should pronounce the G to make clear what you're talking about. So the GNU manifesto, Richard Stallman is a problematic character. I don't necessarily agree with most of him, but the GNU Software Foundation, or no, the GNU, so what is it? The Free Software Foundation, but the GNU organization, is it GNU Software Foundation? I'll have to flip back there and look. Exercise for the listener. The manifesto is interesting. It's a little rambly. It's got some clarifications later, but the bottom line is it's another early days driver of open source software and a Bazaar, although technically I believe GCC used to be developed in a cathedral-like mode. Even though it was open source, it was developed in a top-down sort of behind closed doors mode. If you flip through ESR's commentary, I haven't read it in a long time. It's a good read if you're into this whole entire thing. Open source, business models, the transition to business source licensing by some companies because of business model issues and so on. But I believe it's in his introduction, he talks about how he used to be a big Unix fan. Unix definitely a cathedral model. And then Linus Torvalds came along and said, I'm going to develop this kernel out in the open for all to see and participate in sometimes, while he is a fervent protector of the origin kernel, the real sanctioned, official, signed off on Linux kernel. And he's famously fairly brazen about his commentary. There is nothing to prevent someone from coming up with their own kernel. You can roll your own. And so it's a completely open model that kind of, and it's probably the first big model. Other people were making their sources available and sharing with people and so on, but definitely grew to be mainstream. And so ESR found this to be sort of a game changer. Rather than supporting a cathedral model, why not support more top-down, controlling entities, keeping things behind those closed doors and so on? Why not throw the floodgates open in a Bazaar model where people could come and see and interact and contribute and take pieces with in a compliant, license compliant way, but could take and learn from certain things. And the whole entire notion of open source development and the open source quote unquote community is not a word I use too often. I think it's too easily thrown around, but in the early days, the people who were working together on open source projects kind of had a new notion, like, oh, we can actually just throw everything out there for people to look at, play with. Obviously, the invention also by Linus Torvalds of Git and the adoption by the likes of GitHub, GitLab, BitKeeper. There's one more I'm thinking, but anyway, there are several companies have been built around the services of Git, which is an important thing to note as a little sidebar. Git is free and open source software. You can take Git and build a company around it and charge money for people to use it because they're paying for the infrastructure, support, additional features that are added on, etc. The core product based on Git, the core services, open source, free to you can roll your own GitHub, which is part of the origin story of GitLab. You can take open source software and build a business around it, and you succeed when you do a really good job at it, just like the rest of business in general. So if you're good at it, you can take an open source product, make it better, and charge money for the effort that you add to it. It doesn't actually destroy anything. It doesn't undo anything. It's one of the troubling things about the business source license, which is a different conversation for another day. So the GNU Manifesto, flip through it. The open source initiative definition of open source at the opensource.org site, OSD, open source definition. There are all kinds of rules that spell that out, what it means to call something open source. This has become particularly interesting again in this new era of open source AI. And what does that really mean? And finally, a link to a Bruce Perrin's website, which is in its very early days. While today it is not as good as the Innovate for Vegas homepage, it will catch up quickly. But right now, it's a very Spartan website, a few placeholders. Essentially, postopen.org is what comes after open source. Now, Bruce Perrins is a very strong proponent of open source, so it's not get rid of open source, but how do you turn open source into a viable business, a sustainable business, without sacrificing some of the premise that is open source, that makes it what it is. So these are some interesting links to flip through. They're not specifically what we're talking about today. They're sort of adjacent, sort of part of the motivation and the platform on which we are focusing our efforts. But we do indeed completely support the Bazaar model of project initiative and component project development. It's important to know what those things are, though, especially the key one, which I'll touch on at the end, but I'll say it right here up front. What's in it for me? How can I work for free? These are common. These are not just for the Innovate for Vegas Foundation and people who have come and gone over the 2 years and some months that we've existed. 2 years and 4 months, I think it is. So yeah, what is in it for you? The Bazaar model, open source, the entire platform of open source is really about a long tail. Long tail is another expression that we've talked about and we've all heard about. The notion that you don't always get everything right up front. Sometimes it's over a long period of time. The return on your investment may come in a variety of forms. If you heard that, that's Production by Street. I have talked about this previously. I presented our sort of secondary business model very early on. I think it was probably in the first 3 months of our formation, of our incorporation as a Nevada nonprofit, where if you work on open source projects and we are able to do something like the GitHub model, so you take an open source project and you deploy it as a commercialized service, platform, tool, you can monetize that without sacrificing the open source underpinnings. And the people who contribute to the open source project are the people who enable that commercialization effort. Optionally, right? You're not required. You're not forced to continue working on your projects. However, you would always be a contributor to the project, always given credit. And of course, part of the model would be to support open source developers in our commercialization effort. So the commercialization of open source software I've already given at least one example that has been successful. The Linux kernel has found its way to be sustainable through the Linux Foundation. There are a variety of ways to do it. Not everybody takes those paths, and they instead decide to change midstream. Not a fan of that. And now, of course, things happen. It's sometimes you got to do what you got to do. HashiCorp, Redis. Often when a founder departs a company, the new management comes in and says, what are we giving away all of our stuff? So there is a sort of an ethos that is part of the early founding, the notions that go into its early days of what becomes a large project. It's not always the case that a project will become as influential and as critical as something like Terraform from HashiCorp or Redis from, I can't remember, Redis went through a naming kerfuffle when they were doing whatever acquisition or merging or whatever was happening back then. But these are only two examples. There are more. It's not always good. It's not always good for the community. What the reaction usually is to fork a project, come up with something even better. Because when we become aware of what we're going to lose, we might say, oh, no, I need to have Terraform stay in its current state of readiness and usability. I can't break my entire company because you decided you couldn't make money because you didn't plan your business. Obviously, I have a slanted view on this. And so OpenTofu arose. Take the last proper open source licensed source from the main tree, fork it, and build OpenTofu. Redis has become an open source version of it called Valkey. There are more. So the Bazaar, interestingly enough, probably wants to stay Bazaar. I still mean Bazaar. Once you have created a platform and an environment where people can contribute and use the tools that they're contributing to, and you decide to change the name of the game into, well, our company needs to make money, therefore, whatever comes after that becomes hard to hear. So the Bazaar model, rather than turning a Bazaar into a cathedral and saying, well, certain people can use the software in exchange for money, and in some cases, I believe contributors are being required to sign off on agreements about usage. Now, there is a contributor agreement when you contribute to open source to protect the project, just in case someone makes an open source contribution that is not theirs to make. So you're either implicitly or more ideally explicitly agreeing that, yes, I have the rights to what I am contributing to this platform. That's actually not, it's sort of the opposite of limiting rights. You're saying you won't find yourself getting a cease and desist or other lawsuit or other action taken against you for using something that I added to your source base. I won't cause problems later by contributing this. And I'm using the example of software open source project, so contribution of software. Ideally, open source, the whole notion it already has, but expand beyond the domain of coders, software engineers, software developers. So on that note, let's begin. Everything old is new again, sort of. Open source software and other things besides software are an essential, established essential fact of life. Most things we all do daily involve and are in some cases made easier by the efforts of open source developers, innovators, and even newcomers, people that are just coming on the scene with something to add, something to say, something new to build. Open source is getting more attention lately with so-called open source AI coming onto the scene. Some statements by the likes of Mark Zuckerberg. I'm going to let that one sit for a while, but he's sort of said something like, I'm going to focus the next, 10 years of his efforts, I guess, with the Meta company and his own efforts. They're going to focus on making open source everything and changing the world or so on. Open source has been around for a while, so it's not a new idea. Companies have contributed to open source, not a new idea. So we'll see. We'll see what Zuckerberg comes up with. He doesn't have a great track record when it comes to what he does with what he's doing, if that makes sense. I want to use open source to collect more personally identifying information and crush any notion of privacy and alter the minds of young people in negative ways. Yeah, who knows? But they're going to contribute to the open source world, and then some of the chicanery again with the license transitions, HashiCorp, Redis. There are more. That's not what I'm talking about today, so I didn't really jot down too many of them. But these are companies that are shining a light, not always in a positive way, on the nature of open source and how occasionally business interests not considered early enough will force a change in interaction with your customers, and that may not go well. It is all interesting, and if this is your thing, it's a part of a larger collection of things to keep track of. Bruce Perens, as I mentioned, is another big name in the niche population of open source advocates, strong open source advocates. I first came upon Bruce Perens when I first started using the Debian distribution of Linux, of GNU Linux, in fact. And interestingly, Debian was one of the first to really underscore its GNU Linux basis. The Linux kernel and the GNU toolchain and several other GNU software tools and so on. So Bruce has been around for quite a while. He's a strong advocate for open source, and the Post-Open project aims to spell out a way to essentially not do what people are doing now, business people are doing now when it comes to sort of a rug pull. When you surprise people, hey, the thing that you were basing your entire future business, product, services, you're basing it on this open source project. Well, we're going to make some changes that kind of make your future untenable or difficult or expensive. So these are unexpected. They used to be unexpected. Now they're sort of par for the course, which is unfortunate. So technically open source projects are already commercially viable if you think about it ahead of time, perhaps. So we'll see. We'll see what comes of post-open. Bruce, again, not always bringing people together. Something of a divisive character now and then, but mostly in the name or for the sake of open source. Now, I have not kept track of his career. He may have said or done something even more unpopular, but he's coming from a place of supporting open source and open source efforts, open source developers, open source contributors, people who make it all go. So it'll be worth checking out. It'll be worth keeping an eye on post-open and related efforts, and he will probably mention those too. So what about this working for free thing? What's in it for me? Is there free food? All these things you hear when you mention working on open source projects. There is little appreciation from the greater world for work done for free. That's a general rule. The problem, if I may, is that humans rarely properly value things they receive for free, even if those things are of infinite real value. Take, for example, the water that falls from the sky, potable mostly. We call it rain. It's a great example. You don't have to pay for that. And in some cases, it's not quite potable. Sometimes air pollution has been the undoing. But generally speaking, in ideal situations, like natural situations, the water that falls from the sky, completely free of charge for you to drink. And water is pretty essential. It makes up a substantial fraction of you. We cannot live without it. I want to say, 4 or 5 days of water fasting? That won't end well. So it's a problem for open source, especially open source developers sometimes, if people don't value the work that you're doing. Oh, you're doing it for free. What, I got to pay for that? Sometimes a company will pay their employees or otherwise compensate time for contributions to open source projects, but not always. Now, I did work for Intel Corporation briefly in the Maker Innovator Group, and everything we were doing there was open source, and they were paying people. Maybe they still are. Intel's had some difficult times. Don't look good. But they were paying their employees to contribute to the Linux kernel, to contribute to other open source projects, to develop open source technologies. All of the Maker Innovator stuff, like I said, open source. So some tremendous contributions on the part of companies like Intel, IBM, Google even. Now, IBM famously purchased Red Hat. They have also gone through some licensing chicanery and so on. So I'm speaking historically, but Intel has been pretty good about understanding that we're selling hardware, we should be enabling more people to buy and use our hardware. And fun fact, Linux was developed on an Intel 8386 machine. Linus Torvalds' computer on which he was building Linux. If you look through the old days, you'll see that, well, so far it only works really on an i386. So just from a historical marketing standpoint, Intel's kind of on the hook for that. So if you can pay your employees, or you can pay the contributors to a project you depend on so that they can continue, then that works. Some entities, whether they're companies or even government agencies, have even been known to contribute through a straight donation. So you might just donate to a project, or to contract, provide sort of a project agreement to work on a project, to work on some variation, to support it. Code for America and similar organizations can work with volunteer developers, open source projects. Good may come of it, and some of the support comes from payment on work agreements, project agreements, and so on. If there are still any of those doing this, enabling open source development and community elevation together, two great tastes, once again. So more often it is the old school exchange, effort into one project in return for use of another project, in a big economy of shared effort and utility. So in other words, I get tremendous value from the Linux kernel and from the GNU toolchain and from the Mozilla Firefox browser, the various web servers. I always go with Apache because that was the first one I started using. From the Apache Software Foundation, Apache does a tremendous amount of open source work. So these various entities that are working on open source projects that I use, so it kind of behooves me to contribute to the same pool. Even though I'm one person standing on the shoulders of these giants, I can do one person's worth at least. So that is usually how things work out. It's rare that a one person, especially a student, a researcher, someone who's already working on open source perhaps, it's rare that they can jump in and say, oh, let me pay for a contract to continue using Terraform under the business source license. It becomes tricky when money starts being counted. But on the other hand, if you do all of your work for free because other people are doing their work for free, and you're in a big giant economy of open source, shared effort and utility. So, hey, I'm going to build a tool that works because you built the other tools that I'm going to use to make my tools, and they'll help someone else down the chain. It all sounds great. But as we have all become familiar, more familiar even lately, thanks to cryptocurrencies, working in the blockchain space is one thing, but extracting real legal tender when you sell your Bitcoin or whatever and turn it into dollars that the world accepts. And I always say, when you express dollars in Bitcoin, then we'll talk. But until then, you're really just using a transaction medium, cryptocurrency, a storage of value, highly volatile, etc. But the thing we all know, even if you're not participating in that marketplace, which I am not, I don't trade in cryptocurrencies. When you sell your cryptocurrency in exchange for dollars, for example, the market sees that immediately and can react. And so as you're trying to extract the dollar value of your currency, it's harder than it looks. Same can be true of interoperating, intercollaborating on open source projects. Hey, I get what I need, you get what you need, somebody else gets something thanks to our collaborative efforts and so on. But I got to pay some bills. And converting goodwill, harmony, high utility to cash is not as easy. So that's one of the bridges to cross, definitely. There has to be a personal value proposition. The value to one individual contributor can vary wildly, but I will say from my own experiences, there is a lot to learn from open source software or otherwise. Open source is always, synonymously used with software projects, but open source can apply to other things, open hardware, open source recipes for things, open source construction models, open source 3D modeling, shape files, and so on. So there's open source data for use by communities, opendata.gov, for example, one place to check out. So open source doesn't necessarily just mean software development, but it so often is conflated with that. That's fine. the value that comes from contributing to a project, whether a solo project or to the Linux kernel or Postgres or something even bigger. So it could be anywhere on this size spectrum, size being like lines of code or amount of data or deliciousness of recipe, whatever it is, comes down the road. You don't get that return immediately. When the tools and the environment in which these projects exists get better, stronger, and smarter. So contributions made now, the realization of those contributions now don't always happen now. There's not a paycheck coming every 2 weeks, semi-monthly or bi-weekly or other. There's no net 30 or 90 on an individual contributing to a project that will become valuable over months and years. That's a different thing. So the personal value proposition has to be different. I have contributed to open source myself, nothing huge, but that can change. And it is changing with our foundation specifically. This can be the case for you as well. Or something you know who might be interested? No, it's someone. What's my notes? Someone. There you go. So it could be you or someone you know who might be interested in open source anything. And I should point out, open source projects also need testing. They need some degree of program or project management. They need some notion of documentation, user experience awareness, user interface design, internationalization and localization. There's something called co-creation, which involves interacting with your future customers or even current customers. The customers are the people that use your stuff. So if you're opening a restaurant with open source recipes, you can co-create with your customers. That's very simple. How is it? With software, with hardware, with other larger, more detailed or intricate projects, it's a little bit more tricky, but it's still the same question. How is it? Tell me what we need to fix. What are we missing? What are we lacking? What could be improved? So a co-creation effort actually takes effort. So all of these are not necessarily coding roles. And as I've talked about before, as part of our name change, I think I'm going to mention it soon anyway, so I'll leave that there. The on-ramp is not always obvious. Where to begin? And this is a question to answer. Next week is Oktoberfest. 2024 begins. Oktoberfest faces its own challenges on the individual and small project side. If you've ever had a bunch of people come in the door and say, "Hey, I don't know what we're doing, but we want to help," it doesn't always happen instantly. So more interesting, perhaps, is the notion that that doesn't get much attention. That people can contribute to open source projects even if they are not coders, as I've already said. Our foundation name change previously from Code for Vegas Foundation to Innovate for Vegas Foundation was prompted in larger part, by the fact that people would literally say, "I am not a coder, therefore I am not welcome," ? And I would say not everything is code, and many projects benefit from all manner of non-code contributions, as I've detailed immediately previously. Coders need help. We all know it. Anyone who's ever seen a really, really confusing, difficult, unaesthetic user interface or website, you're probably looking at something I worked on. No, but you're looking at something that is technically useful, but not humanly useful. So that's where the coders can give way somewhat to more creative or more human interactive people who spend more time on aesthetics, user interface design, not coding logic, because they are all great tastes that taste great together. So making contributions to open source projects could be finding a bug or defect or an issue of some sort and describing it. Could be making a feature request. It could be pointing out something that is maybe a bug, but maybe doesn't work as expected, doesn't quite do what it could do. So technically not a bug and sort of a feature request, but more of a, well, they call it an enhancement request. Like, oh, this would be so much more useful if it did this one extra thing. So it's not broken, and you're not asking for a new thing. You're just asking for the thing it does to be augmented a little bit. Either way, you can make contributions to open source projects in any number of ways. And that's how that journey begins. So the Bazaar, we have 2 more sections. That's it. This one and one more. The Bazaar, we, like almost everybody else in the open source world use the Bazaar approach here at the Innovate for Vegas Foundation, keeping our initiatives and component projects open for others to see. And that's our GitHub organization I mentioned earlier. When I mentioned that we're going to have a microsite approach, GitHub pages are the starting point. Essentially, every component project, which is realized as a repository on GitHub most of the time, can have its own little micro website. So we can attach all of that to a top level GitHub pages website deployment for things like Agile for Volunteers, Project Act. The notion being anyone should be able to see what we're working on and not be a coder. So GitHub can be a little bit disconcerting for some. Well, I'm not a coder. That's a coder tool. It'd be like a programmer using Photoshop, right? Except that we do use Photoshop, or more likely the GNU image manipulation program. So yeah, there's really no reason to feel kept out, to be blocked. You're always welcome. The Bazaar model does not say, oh, you're not a coder, therefore you're not welcome. Quite the opposite. So if our component projects and our initiatives can all be visited as websites, so much the better. So keeping everything open, visible, hopefully will attract other contributors if we are discovered. So if you come upon our project, one of our initiatives, the Open Transit initiative from our first early days of formation, still needs some love and attention. It's completely viable. It could spin off to be its own company even, who knows? So we'll always keep our stuff open, and it will be the case in perpetuity, and hopefully for more initiatives and component projects coming along. So we aren't going to, turn around and say, oh, guess what? Business source license. And I've talked about this before. One of the reasons everything that we're doing is GNU, GPL v3. There's an argument to be made for GPL v2, maybe, but essentially, and maybe the Affero, GPL, AGPL, does that have a number on it? There are MIT and Apache and similar licenses and BSD especially, that's probably been around the longest, where you can take a project and use it as you see fit. You can turn it into a commercial project. You don't have to release source code and so on. To me, if you ask civic volunteers to contribute to a project, that should not be something that can easily turn into a commercial money-making project for someone else without you getting at least a mention. So big on attribution, which is part of the personal value proposition. So to this end, we are leaning in completely on so we're leaning in completely, if I can emphasize my words correctly, on the Agile for Volunteers model, which we are developing based on the original Agile Manifesto, not on the perturbations that have taken place in the Agile Industrial Complex. The original Agile Manifesto is essentially is not a rule book. It is a collection of principles. These are some ideas to get started, and you can take them in any direction. And I recently saw a commentary that essentially, and this is true, the Agile Manifesto was written by and for software developers, software engineers, people that were in the business, because they wanted to make good stuff. They wanted to make stuff that worked, that did what people wanted it to do. You want to deliver a product to your customer that does what they expected or what they're paying for. And it's been co-opted as a management infrastructure, as a tool to be used against people. I've had this discussion individually with people about the misuse of story points, and we talked about that last week 2 weeks ago? No, when was it? Where did I talk about this? With points. I think it was 2 weeks ago. Points. User story points they were designed, where was this? Yeah, points, episode 82, 2 weeks ago. Story points were designed to keep a pace so that people could figure out how much work we can accomplish together, people you worked with on a regular basis. You establish a rhythm or a pace, as I use that term. So if you know about how much you can do over a period of time, then you can set that comfortable pace and you can operate predictably, and you can spend less time worrying about estimations and more time on doing cool stuff. If this is co-opted into a grading scheme, a check, like, hey, how come you didn't get as much done this week? We need to have a one-on-one meeting. Stand-up meetings have so often become something else. They've become a requirement for FaceTime. That is, I just want to make sure everybody's still here. Often the whole team approach, which is based again on the notion of goodwill, that everybody working on a project wants it to be good. They want it to be even excellent, right? Technically, no one wants to be a part of shipping something bad. No one wants to let something out the door that they know is broken. But unfortunately, you don't always have a say in that. So the take home from Agile, the original manifesto, is that we, the people that work on this stuff, want to include others. That was a little Amazon product noise sound effects there. We want to include the customer that's using our project, our outcomes, our deployment, our development efforts. We want to include the management infrastructure because they are paying us after all. So it wasn't about a cathedral. They were literally forming an internal bazaar. Like, how can we all be a part of this development effort? But it has so often, and I've been in this situation a couple of times, it has become, here's the thing we're going to work on. So the spec is written. Here's the part of the project that you're going to work on for the next sprint. We're going to have stand-up meetings every day, and we're going to score that. It's basically you're being told what to do according to this corrupt version. So Agile for Volunteers, that was an editorial. The Agile for Volunteers notion starts with the Agile Manifesto Foundation, and then proposes that, first of all, not everyone is a software engineer. So Agile for Volunteers means volunteers of all stripes, all flavors, all colors, all skill sets, all interests, everything. I meant in the very abstract sense with all those adjectives. So Agile for Volunteers is about volunteering your time, effort, and expertise toward initiatives and component projects. Could be anything. Anything that we're developing or even things we're not developing, because part of the whole team approach is come with an idea. Maybe it's something we should all spend some time and effort on and expertise. So by providing these base principles and methods for all volunteers, all potential contributors to our projects, with an open workflow, that is, we have on the table the iteration method, the sprint notion. So you iterate for a certain number of days, but with the awareness that you are not employees as civic volunteers. So you cannot measure a work week or 2 work weeks. These are not realities. At the same time, you can measure the pace of effort so that people that are volunteering their time can judge how much they want to volunteer accordingly. If you have a lot of time to contribute to something, but the other people working on whatever the component is do not, you shouldn't make yourself available and then find yourself not able to collaborate in the sense of time availability. So we have to be aware that volunteer time is gold, and we need to not necessarily account for it in a scoring fashion, but measure it as far as how much of your time can you contribute so that you don't feel you are wasting it, and how can you contribute, and how can others appreciate that time, and vice versa. So we need to value the whole team contributions, whether those contributions are coming from members of the Innovate for Vegas Foundation proper, like they are, in quotes, members of the foundation. Maybe they're part of the GitHub organization, but that's the usual. We're using GitHub as a project management and team management tool. But they could be from somewhere else. And the pull request scheme of GitHub is not always popular, but it would work in this case pretty much as we needed to. So you could be from another cohort, another part of the country. You could be on another planet. You might be just one person who has some desire to contribute to the Open Transit Project initiative. Great. So you should be able to jump into an Agile for Volunteers initiative, component projects. You should be able to see what people are working on, who is working on what, when, what needs attention, some defects, some user stories for features, different tasks per component project, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we can come up with a standard, easily navigable interface to what we're trying to accomplish. Then someone who wants to volunteer their time hopefully will be able to do so without spending some of that precious volunteer time trying to figure out what's going on. How can I contribute? Well, here, read this spec. And trust me, I know how to write very long documents that nobody wants to read. Our Project ACT initiative, ACT, was conceived in the wake of the sunsetting of the Code for Vegas Brigade program, which was in December of 2023. We actually started talking about this in October of 2022, believe it or not. It was when it was becoming clear that the brigade program was not meeting the needs of all of the cohorts, the brigades that were a part of it. So autonomous cohort transformation was quite literally, which we had done. What if we want to do this that we're doing? We want to work on civic volunteer projects and community elevation and so on, but we're not happy with the infrastructure that we are a part of. So how can we transform from a brigade to an autonomous cohort? So that was the origin story. And while that's still on the table, the sunsetting of the program in December of 2023 has somewhat obviated that need, because now you're all independent, but you still need to consider how to transform into a viable cohort, right? What's necessary, what is required, what would help. And I say necessary and required if you want to form a nonprofit, if you want to form a charity organization, if you want to be a fiscally sponsored entity, if you want to work with young people and you want to make sure that parents are involved and permissions and all the little details, all the little the facets that make it sparkly. And we add to that the autonomous cohort tessellation, which I described at the top of the show. It is a completely bottom-up effort to establish a connection network of sorts to enable discovery, and then to promote connection and communication, and ultimately collaboration between civic volunteers and others. And open source developers, they could be civic volunteers or by any other name, to spend real effort on community elevation endeavors. So people who want to work on things that are generally aligned with other people who want to work on similar things should be able to discover that this is the case. They should be able to communicate and collaborate. If someone else is working on an open transit-like project initiative, we should be able to connect somehow. We should be able to discover each other. Well, that can be tricky. So we want to make that easier. We also want to make it easier for the rest of the world, the universe, to discover and recognize and even celebrate the efforts of civic volunteers and open source developers. So the tessellation is practically, it's the method to construct a network of cohorts and individuals and projects and initiatives and who's working on what, how do they fit together, what can I spend some volunteer time on this Friday, et cetera, et cetera. But from a sort of from a what would you call it, like a marketing sense or a public storytelling sense, I suppose, which is also practical, the ability to create a visualization of this network of volunteers and projects and maybe outcomes that is literally a mosaic, right? The mosaic has so many meanings, physical meanings and implication, right? So a mosaic of many colors and textures, different projects, cohorts, individuals contributing to different things that kind of fit together. You could represent it as a map of the country. It could be the United States, could be the world. Hopefully more people will want to participate in such things. But also you could build mosaics around different focus areas, right? Like food, potable water, access to healthcare, energy, internet access, transportation, general well-being. So the way that you construct a mosaic of interconnected efforts, people, projects, and so on could vary, right? The geographical map of where these projects are taking place is kind of the obvious one. Guess what? We open that up to other views and opinions. And if the data is available, you can create your own. Connection, communication, and collaboration. These are some of the bottom-up secrets to how open source can and has been successful, can continue to be, and has been successful. So I will end the final section here. Bottom up versus top down. The take home is building local with people on the ground, so to speak, who know what works and what doesn't, what's going on in your community, what's going on in your neighborhood, what's going on in your city or county, even your state, but being closer to what's going on and being able to make decisions in a cohort together is probably more efficient 99% of the time. If you can empower the people who want to implement innovation, they're probably next to you or near you. So it's a little bit easier to speak the same language, to get on the same page, and so on. These go hand in hand with open source and community development, community elevation, whether it's a web app or a world-changing platform that trusts people enough to be open, right? So a lot of things can happen when you start with, hey, we have a problem to solve, and we have people who want to solve it. Do we need to ask anyone? Nope. Do we need to get permission from on high? Nope. Do we have to be a part of a larger... Nope. In the words of a famous athletic sneaker manufacturer, just do it. Top-down hierarchies are expensive. The decisions are made from above, work done down below. That always bothered me for open source and volunteer projects. History tells us that central planning, capital C, capital P, central planning does not scale when it comes to resource management. Centrally planning or discussing ideation, is one thing. You can ideate on protocols, on methods, on best practices. This happens all the time. Look at the slow-moving W3C. Look at various work groups, standards bodies. They take forever, but they try to make a system that works so that various implementers can build things that interoperate. It doesn't always go well because central planning is hard and expensive. It takes a lot of time. It sometimes takes a lot of money. So ideation, centrally planning ideas is one thing, but driving innovation and implementation is a different thing entirely. And in the open source world, it's best done by individuals and cohorts making it happen. If you are waiting for someone in another city or state to tell you what to do, to hand you that specification, that's part of the problem with the agile industrial complex, is that a system of goodwill, of best intentions, of enabling the value that is found in individual contributors so that they can work even better together. Making all that stuff happen has been turned into a grading system for managing up, keeping people happy who are not hands-on, and so on. I need to know how many points were completed this week. What does that even mean? If we wait for top-down, cathedral-like planning and direction, we may be disappointed. We will likely be frustrated, and we will definitely be waiting. This is one of the core principles driving Innovate for Vegas Foundation initiatives. And if our bazaar is interesting, if we take it on the road, virtual road, and convince others to join in or to roll their own, the Agile for Volunteers stuff, all open. All the tools, all the methods, all the forms, all the workflow, everything. Take it, make it better. Tell us how you made it better. That'd be nice. But if there's a better way to do what we're trying to accomplish, why would we prevent that? So we take this on the virtual road. You can innovate for Vegas. You don't have to innovate in Vegas, as that saying goes. If we can convince others to join in and roll their own, if we can get it on to the next bit, maybe people will use Agile for Volunteers for their projects. Maybe we can connect people through Project Act, so the people who want to collaborate on projects and initiatives. And I always use the Friday model, like I have time on Fridays to contribute to open source projects that I'm not working on. Sort of the 20% thing, but maybe it's not even 10%, 5%. I have some time and I have some expertise and I could help a project. How do I find projects? Google? So we need to make that part easier. We need to lower the barrier of entry to contribution of really valuable volunteer time. And if there's an interface like Agile for Volunteers, but it could be something similar or it could be completely different. But a way to quickly identify where the tasks are, what needs to be done, what is waiting to be done. If we can make that part easier, if we can make it easy to join in on a project temporarily or on a longer term basis, we will have accomplished what we set out to do. We don't have to tell people what to do, though. We can invite them to participate while we work bazaar-like on our initiatives and component projects. The ROI plans for active contributors who make initiatives and component projects into functioning systems is the long-term goal, so that we can provide that return on investment of your time, effort, and expertise. Spin off these various initiatives into something like little startups, and at which point things continue to be interesting. And since I've already covered this in previous episodes, I will cover it again as we have Project Act and Agile for Volunteers in a usable states. To remind people of this, which I will summarize very briefly here, if you're willing, I do not want to have people work for free, but I am more than interested and maybe even excited based on what I'm trying to accomplish here to work for people willing to work for free. So if you are willing to be a part of that notion, the idea is to take civic volunteer time, effort, and expertise contributed to various initiatives and component projects to make them into usable, tangible things, if you will. We deploy those and commercialize them. And that is the return on investment that everyone is looking for. What's in it for me? Well, start off being a part of this effort. And the ultimate goal is to get something back, make our communities better, convert some of your effort into something a little bit more tangible. So the bazaar hopefully will work. It has worked many times over decades. So this is not a wild gamble, but we are assuming that people will adopt this notion that they can volunteer now and turn projects into deployed commercializable entities later, and that they will be able to benefit from it. So that's our model. And the bazaar is interesting. The way the world is adjusting itself to business models, open source, not as open source, the business source license. And there are some caveats to that. You should check that out for yourself, but it's not making people happy. The ability to uplift rather than curtail, it all kind of fits together. Anyway, that's the show for this week. We got tons of work to do, tons and tons. Trying to get some stuff to gel, to congeal, to solidify, so we can have a solid foundation to continue building on. So that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Don't forget, we are a volunteer organization. We all get paid the same. So join in if you like. Don't forget to check out our website for some contact information. We have a Discord server that we don't use as much. There will be more ways to stay in touch, part of our Smart Social, My Muni, Welcome initiatives, and so on. So much more to talk about, but not today. Thank you.